Hi, it's Julius from DeliCode. Welcome to the third and final installment of the basics tutorial series for Z-Vector. In this tutorial series, we'll be covering most of the remaining parts of the user interface. We'll be going through things such as using 2D images or video for texture, using the Rutt Etra style effector in Z-Vector, using the background controls for effect, as well as using distortion for effect. Now, before we move on to the actual tutorials, as I did in the previous installments, I'd like to point out that you can always find the written and illustrated versions of these tutorials online on our user forum. Now let's move forward. Hello and welcome to the first part of this tutorial series. In this part, we'll be talking about how to use 2D images and video for texture. Before moving forward, I'd like to point out that since version 1.1, Z-Vector has offered support for the texture transfer protocols Siphon on macOS and Spout on Windows. However, we won't be going into those in detail in this tutorial, but rather in a later one. Now, before we move on with the actual tutorial, let's open up a rendering output. If you had a second screen, you could open up for full screen here, but as I'm confined to just using one screen right now for the purpose of making this tutorial, I'll just open up a window. And then I think I'll up the count a little bit again and choose surfaces as my geometry. Now, just to make things a little bit more interesting, I think that instead of showing myself here, I'll just use one of the RGBD clips that come with the software. So I'll launch this one, for example. And then I'll use auto filter to filter the human form out of the image. Now this is a good start. So let's move on to the actual texturing part. So we'll actually create a kind of a virtual background. And as I start to move the slider here, you can see that I'm starting to kind of take away the background behind the human figure there. But it's not actually showing up on the renderer. So that's because I'm currently using Profile A, and over here I have a little preview window to what's actually in the background of Profile A. And currently it's black, so I'll just right click on that part there and choose clear to white. And there we go. We have an actual background plane. And now as I click on any of these presets that come with the software, so these are preset CC0 images that come with the software, we will actually be texturing that background with that image. So I'll just take, for example, that smoke plume there. There we go. Now we have a background image. But as always, you know, moving image might be more interesting here. So let's cover that next. I'll actually open up Chrome. And now for the purposes of this tutorial, I will refer to the awesome work of people and just download one of people's awesome Creative Commons clips. So I'll just do this one, for example, Xan. I'll move over to the Vimeo page, download it. I'll take this one. And as that downloads, we'll actually actually I have the file right here, so I'll just move over to downloads. And we can just open up the user interface here. We'll go to an empty bank, and then I'll just drag and drop this file over here. However, right now, what Z-Vector is telling me is that video playback is not possible. I have not pre-installed Vidiot for the computer yet, so I'll just do that right now. Vidiot is an open source companion video player software that we've created for you to make it or to make it as simple as possible for you or me to actually use video with ZVector with as many standards as possible. And for video texture transfer, we actually do use Spout on Windows and Siphon on Mac, but we won't go into detail on that just now. And the only thing that I need to do when I'm installing video is to, on Mac OS, I need to copy it to applications. And there we go. And once video is available, ZVector should detect it automatically. And now as I click on Xan on the file that I just downloaded or I had downloaded previously, it should start playing back. And there we go. Now you only need to install video once. Now as we're playing back video, now let's then try to texture the actual human form with the video. So I'll just move away the background, take it away, and then I will use something over here in the background. I have something called replace, and I can do that. And now I have actually replaced the texture for the human form with the video. That's it for this part. Let's move to the next one. Hello and welcome to the second part of this tutorial series. This part covers how to use the Rutt Etra style, that is a 2D to 3D conversion style effect in ZVector. This particular effect can be used for some interesting results when mixing video with a depth feed, or you could just use it to manipulate your existing 2D video. Now let's first bring up the background. We'll just move the background so that it's completely over any content, depth content that we have. So I'll just move it to about 250, for example. And then just move all the controls and play with these two values, so Z convert and Z phase. I've upped my count to maximum at this point, just to make a nicer effect. And as I move this particular slider here, you start to see how the image gets kind of pseudo converted into 3D. How this particular effect looks and how it works, it depends completely on the input video. So some video it works very nicely with, and then with some video it doesn't work at all. And then we'll just use the phase, or change the phase a little bit. So you'll see what that actually does. It just changes the phase of the conversion process. That's it. Let's move to this next part of this video tutorial. Hello and welcome to the third part of this tutorial series. And this part will be talking about how to use background controls for effect. Now I'll just put back all the different settings before moving forward, before going forward. I'll just remove the background there and go back to my own feed and remove auto filter. So hello. So that's me. So before we dive into what the actual background controls do, let's recap on how ZVector works. The depth map inputs are basically grids of a certain resolution, with the size of the grid depending on the resolution of the depth sensor in use. So for example, if you were using a Kinect for Xbox 360, the resolution would be 640 times 480 pixels. In case you ever played with one, you could think of the resulting grid as a kind of a dynamic, constantly updated pin toy. If you remember those things from the 80s, or whenever they were invented, that you could actually push your hand through, and that would actually change the position of the pins, which were all a certain length and then some of those pins would be pushed forward while others would remain back. And you then, taking your hand away from that thing, you could kind of look at, oh wow, this is my hand. So that's basically how you could think of the thing that we're saying here. It's actually a kind of a 3D interactive pin toy. Now, what the background controls do, these are here, they actually constantly they manipulate how those individual 3D pins or 3D pixels in our case, or geometrical forms that make up the grid, how do they then act in various situations. And in this toolkit, your main tool is definitely bleed. So it's this controller here. With bleed, you're basically able to direct the amount of time each individual 3D pixel takes to transition from a foreground pixel to a background pixel. Now, in order to understand what that means, let's try to set your geometry count to a relatively high value, like I've done right over here. So set the count high, and then we'll just up the bleed count to maximum, and I'll just wave my hand. Now, as you can see, those pixels that change depth, they then essentially take some time to transition to whatever depth lies behind them. So that's that particular effect. So when my hand moves and those particular pins, or in our case, of course, 3D pixels, move, then how much time do they need to transition back to the background? So the actual wall behind me. And if I take the bleed completely away, you'll see that the transition is immediate. Now, bleed, especially when combined with other controllers in the background section, so namely spread, gravity, and wind, will produce interesting effects depending on your geometry settings. Spread controls the scale of your background plane. So this is the place where your individual 3D pixels will try to return to. Gravity moves the background plane on the y-axis while adding some gravity, like acceleration effects, to the 3D pixels. And finally, wind moves the background plane on the y-axis. And then finally, there's also colorize, which affects the color of the 3D pixels as they move towards the background. We won't be talking about colorize that much now, but you can try out the effect after watching this tutorial. But for now, we'll stick to bleed. Let's put bleed. Actually, to make things interesting, I'll again move over to, I'll change bleed to 0. I'll put on the RGBD clip that I have here. And then I'll just use auto filter again. And I think I'll go back to background, and why not also enable the nice video that we had previously. So there we go. Now I'm going to just start to up the bleed, and you can kind of see this nice transitional effect, but in a much clearer form now than with using my camera, for example. I'll just put the opacity as high as possible. So I'll just in this tutorial I'll be switching over from using a kind of a full screen image at times. So I'll go to full screen now so that you see the effect. It looks kind of nice. And then I'll also try to move the spread a little bit. So what I've done now is I've actually went to, I think, -100 on spread. So the video plane is actually in front of the human figure right now, but and then I'm having the pixels return to that position. And then I'll go to +100. So this has the same effect, except that the image is the right way around. I'll then try some gravity. And some wind. I'll try to mix the two. Finally, I also have a way to force the background to stay in place, so I can use flatness to do so. So this becomes useful if I'm using the camera. So let's say that I want to focus on her frame. I'll just click her right like that. And now our camera pivot point, like we went through in the previous tutorial series, is now placed in a where she is kind of moving around it, and then I'll just zoom out a little bit. And now I can just do a little camera roll there, just to give you an idea what flatness actually does. So now as I'm moving, I'll just take the wind and gravity out to give a slightly clearer image. But now as we're kind of moving, we're still forcing, this is a kind of a weird effect, but you kind of get the point. We're actually moving the camera, but we're forcing the background to stay completely flat at the same time. You can imagine that this can create some interesting effects depending on the video that's being used. Now, moving forward, let's go to the next part of the tutorial. Hello and welcome to the fourth and final part of this tutorial series. In this part, I'll be talking about how to use distortion for effect. In Z-Vector, distortion is a great way to add dynamics to visuals. Just as with animation controls, the distortion source can be either live audio or synthetic beats. So the source, which lies here, is actually very similar to what you would have in normal animation. If you were animating some other variables in the software. The difference lies in these two modes here. The first one is the frequency mode, so it outputs FFT and the frequency composition of the audio signal. And then we have autocorrelation mode, which on the other hand outputs a strong overall response for periodic audio signals. So these two modes offer kind of an alternative, radical way to control the distortion effects, because their output is actually applied to the whole 3D pixel grid directly for each frame. And this can cause a much kind of more violent effect than you would see. Now, for the purposes of this particular tutorial series, we'll be focusing on using audio for distortion. So I'll just go ahead and put some audio on. I'll play something from our fellow Finns at Kitkaliitto. And now as I've routed audio in, I am actually seeing it over here. And then I can just start to slowly bring this value up. I'll just put those two defaults. And then I'll just start to move those. And now as the audio comes in, you can kind of start seeing the effects of the audio applied to the actual grid. I can move over to different shapes to affect. Different shapes have different effects. You can just try them differently. These are horizontal waves, we have vertical waves, then we have radial waves, we have the horizontal equalizer, and then we have the vertical equalizer. Then we can also change the direction of the waves. So this is completely random. We have sideways, we have up and down, and then we have depth to depth direction, so basically towards ourselves. And Then we have basically we have scale control, so I'll just change to direction to give you a better clue at how this works. I have scale, which basically moves from kind of very low frequency to a very high frequency, and then we have width, which actually affects how wide of an area is getting affected at any time. I'll just set those to defaults. You can always set back to defaults by right-clicking on a controller. That will default normally to 0, but in this case it's to this default values. Now I'm also able to control the center position of the wave, so I'll just create a kind of a clearer image there. Now I can also change the center position of the wave, so wherever the waves get sent from. So that's with X and that's with Y. Now I can also control the balance, which is the balance of the distortion between the background, which lies at -100, and the foreground, which in this case is just the dancer, for example. Just to give you a kind of a demonstration how that works, I'll just up the distortion. So I can kind of create some interesting effects out of this also. I'll leave that on the dancer actually, and then I'll just move over to showcasing how frequency and autocorrelation mode work. So now as we listen to music, you will see that this is much more violent effect that we're kind of seeing compared to what it was before, so they're just using the low. And we'll try autocorrelation. Congratulations, you've just finished the final part of this basics level tutorial series for Z-Vector. Now as the very last thing that's on this video, I've included an improvisation where I'm using many of the features that we've covered in the past 3 video tutorials. So if you have the time, I invite you to take a look and to maybe get some inspiration for your own visuals creation. Thanks, and see you in the intermediate level tutorials.